Good morning.
Good morning.
I am Kent Berghuis, and I am the pastor at the First Baptist Church of Dayton. And I have gotten to know both Steve and Amy through the Baptist World Alliance. And we had some good conversations this past summer and got to talking about their book, Sources of Light, which they edited. And along with Derek Hatch, we went out pretty much every evening, I think, during the Baptist World Alliance there in Birmingham, Alabama this summer. And we had a good time just talking theology and catching up with each other as human beings. And so it was good to connect with some like-minded and enjoyable theological minds. And so I have the privilege of interviewing them today and talking to them in conversation about their book. So, Sources of Light, Resources for Baptist Churches Practicing Theology. I am, of course, a pastor of a Baptist church, as is Amy Chilton, one of our editors here. Steve Harmon is a theologian who also has very much a church ministry orientation as well. So we're all kind of practical theologians, as well as having some kind of academic background here. So I think that's the intention of this book, is to try to bridge that academic discussion for ecclesiology, for church function in some way or another. So by way of just beginning, I suppose I'll just mention things that are here. It says you have 23 different authors, so it makes it a pretty thick book. What do we got here? 350 pages, if you count the back matter. So there's a lot of material here, 23 authors. That's a lot of different essays, but each of the essays is relatively brief as a result. So they're digestible on their own terms, I think, if you don't want to read every one of them and you want to be selective about topics of particular interest. So, but maybe I'll go to each of you to give just a little bit of an overview as to what your purpose was in putting this book together, and just share a little bit about the process and the reasons and what you hope to accomplish. So I don't know who wants to begin. Shall I begin with Steve, since you're there on the top of my screen, and
Okay.
you ready to go?
Well, I do a lot of my work, especially my research and publishing, in ecumenical theology from a Baptist perspective. And that's simply the effort to address some of the theological roots of the church's divisions across its divided history. And one of those projects a few years ago, published in 2016, was a book titled Baptist Identity and the Ecumenical Future. In one chapter of that, I tried to make the argument that just like some other church traditions have their own structures for figuring out what their faith and practice is and how to teach what it means to be the church, the Catholic Church does that with its official magisterium, the bishops in council defining doctrine, defining Christian practice. Some other Reformation traditions have their way of doing that. They may have officially binding confessions of faith, catechetical documents, foundational theologians like Martin Luther or John Calvin, who continue to be influential for the tradition. But I argued that Baptists and other free church Christians do this congregationally. It's a gathered community of people who are seeking to follow Jesus Christ in a particular time and place. And when they figure out together what it means to do that, they're doing this same kind of thing. They're discerning their faith and practice in a particular time and place. And so I tried to make the argument that Baptists could most ideally do that if they're drawing on sources of light. There's a nod toward what became the book title, or various perspectives from the whole church. And by the whole church, I meant the whole church extended through time and space, the church that precedes us historically, the church that shares the world with us today. And so I argued that when a pastor or other church leaders are helping to lead a congregation to do this work of practicing theology, trying to be the church for their time and place, they ought to help the congregation receive light from the whole church. Ancient ecumenical confessions of faith, Reformation era confessions, Baptist confessions, all the way through contemporary, contextual, socially located theologies that can help us see something that we might not have seen in the biblical story, in the practice of our faith. We sometimes are bound to our own contexts and ignore some things that we could receive from people who are living and trying to do this in other contexts. And so this was envisioned as a collaborative effort to figure out what that might look like, what it might mean to receive light from all these varied sources when a particular Christian community is trying to be the church in that time and place.
Thank you, Steve. Amy, what do you have to add to that introduction?
Well, when Steve approached me and asked me to help co-edit this book, I was very excited about the possibility of being with a group of Baptists who care about global theology and doing some systematic theological work with them. My primary area of interest is in global theology, but more specifically, what does it mean for us to do theology as embodied people who are socially embedded in particular forms of community? And then ecumenically, what does it mean to do theology intercontextually? So how am I doing theology from my physically embodied and socially embedded space with people from other body and social space contexts, and how am I being shaped by that? So this project appealed to me for a number of reasons, primarily because of its engagement of global theologies from Baptist perspective. So we had folks who are conscious of doing their theology from their own practicing communities and then engaging other practicing communities and open to being shaped in that process, which I think is really here's the connection between the theological process and my role as my current role as a pastor is how do we be church in a way that we are allowing ourselves to be open and shaped by people who do church differently. So this is why the project itself appealed to me. It was a great deal of fun to think with Steve about who could write particular chapters and what voices could be included, knowing that we simply couldn't include every voice because it would far exceed our page limit imposed on us by the publisher. But thinking through who gets to speak for Black women in womanist theology, for example, and what kinds of Baptists are doing work in these areas or can think critically about how a Baptist in North America might engage in Asian women's theology. So my work now in the local church, I was in the academy when the book was written and published. Now in my work in the local church, I find myself being shaped by the work that we did in this volume. So finding myself more purposefully reaching out for commentary resources written by non-white, non-male scholars, finding myself incorporating prayers into the worship service that are written by non-white, non-Western scholars and attributing those prayers to their authors. So I'm able to bring some of that kind of global theological education piece into my congregation during our worship. So it's been interesting being on both the academic and pastoral side of this text, both in putting it together and now I'm thinking about, okay, how do I really implement the scholarly ideas that we wrote about and engaged with the other authors of this volume on.
Yeah, thank you. I think, as I was reading, what strikes me is the assumptions about how Baptists perhaps typically have done theological reflection, which maybe reflects a larger, for lack of a better word, evangelical kind of tradition or pietistic tradition out of the, post-Reformation, radical Reformation kind of approach, that there's still an awful lot of that. And yet we are, in this book, are maybe seeking to find things we've looked past or maybe argued against in the past, even, let's say, with things that were too Catholic or, too traditional or too ecumenical. And we know that there's a lot of separatist and fundamentalist backlog in our history. And many of us are more progressive and want to kind of re-engage, whether it's the tradition on the one hand, or like what you were saying, Amy, the social locations. And so, we really have those things represented here in the book for those who haven't read the book. Like part 1 is light from our life in context, which is kind of what Amy is emphasizing in what she was just saying. And then part 2, light from life, our life in community. Many of these go back to things related to tradition and sources and creeds and the like. So those two legs, I guess, are what the book stands on. And I appreciate that. Maybe I'll just keep going with you, Amy, for a minute. But in your chapter on light from liberation theologies, I thought that's interesting. And it strikes me of how, like, even liberation theology, on the one hand, is very contextualized to local communities, often to people who are not, let's say, theologically educated, and yet the priests or the pastors or the theologians who are work very hard to put themselves in solidarity with the people in those situations, be it of poverty or oppression or whatnot. And that's something that I think we all feel a sensitivity and attention to. So I appreciate what you had to say there, but here's the challenge I face and as a pastor, and I wonder, Amy, just having become a pastor relatively more recently, gosh, I feel like, when I was a professor, my head was filled with all kinds of great ideas, and I was roaming the world and scraping the galaxy with my thoughts. And I got down to the church, and it's a committee meeting. It's who's going to make the coffee this week, and it's a very granular, simple kind of approach to doing church often. And I wonder if you could say more about how do we bridge that sometimes disconnect with people that aren't used to using the tools of theology, for those of us who maybe got used to trafficking in them to the point where we almost lose our communication ability across that divide.
Yeah, so I had a 2-week gap between teaching upper class college student, that's upperclassmen, and then preaching. So there's always been kind of this overlap. Like Steve, my attention's always been on the church. But I went, within just a matter of days from figuring out, okay, I have to know everything I can know about Kant so that I can educate my students well on the categorical imperative and why, like, Kant is not an individualist. Okay, now I'm preaching to a congregation that maybe read a little bit of Kant 40 years ago in college, but like, he doesn't need to make his way into my sermons necessarily. And I think one thing that I arrived at when I first started here was that really, like, my lectures maybe have 30 things in them, but I just need one thing for my sermon, right? I'm preaching the text, and just one bit of this, stuff that I gathered as I was soaring the universe as a professor is all I need for the sermon. But then on the other hand, I'm trying to be very conscious about doing theological education in my preaching and in my teaching. So for example, we did Reformation Sunday this past week, and I looked at it from the perspective of Luther's protesting the oppression of people for the financial gain of the church. So I was able to then tap into our own history as, with the radical reformers and my church's passion for justice and ending oppression, and put some of this theological education in there by talking about Luther in a way that he wasn't necessarily talked about when I was a seminary student, but a way in which, liberation theologians, read him now. So there is that. I'm teaching a Sunday school class on Genesis right now, and incorporating in that some tools on hermeneutics and interpretation, and they don't necessarily know that while we're doing it. So you're right, this is a very different world than the academy, and I think it definitely has taken adaptability on my part to move between the two worlds. And I think with this book in particular, it's going to take adaptability on the part of the pastoral theologian or the theological pastor to take these grand ideas, for example, this chapter on liberation theology, and then figure out, okay, now how does this connect to my ministry in this place, and how can I do some education on this piece that doesn't involve getting up and giving a lecture on John Sobrino.
Yeah.
So I would say that it is more useful, obviously, for a reader who is passionate about making these kinds of connections and willing to do that work. Mm-hmm. I do appreciate that you pointed out the brevity of the chapters, I think, and Steve, correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, but I think the chapters are about 4,000 words each. Is that correct, Steve?
Yeah, it comes out to about 10 or 12 pages of published text.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, they're very manageable. I want to point, you brought up my chapter, but Susan Shaw's chapter is a very fine example of this as well, where she opens the chapter talking about her experience of being called as a woman in ministry in the Baptist church. And when I read the first draft of that chapter that she sent to us, it just struck me as, oh my gosh, like this is so, we're different generations, but this is so related to my own experience as being a woman who has been called in little B Baptist churches and who has only served in little B and big B Baptist churches, to use McClendon's terminology. And so I think that so many of our authors have made this kind of connection where anybody who has spent some time in the Baptist world, in any number of these chapters can say, wait, like, okay, I get that. Like, I get the struggle over believing that God could call a woman to ministry, or I get that, we believe that priesthood of all believers, and this is how it connects to liberation theology. And so I think there are a lot of good connections between the ways that we experience the church as Baptists and these kind of more global or ancient theologies that the book addresses.
Thank you, Amy. I like that example you shared. And, I know several of these authors personally, and some of them I do not, but one thing that I do know about so many of them that I think people don't realize often is that these theologians are church people. They care about churches. And that has been my experience too in the seminaries I've taught in or been a part of. Most of the people there were deeply entrenched in their local churches, whether they were in ministry in some specific called kind of way or just being lay people. Even in my church, we have people with PhDs teaching at the university in religion and theology and ethics. And here they are, working in our church on the trustee board, or they're teaching Sunday school, and they're thinking and participating in very practical, meaningful ways. And I think that's a beautiful thing that you're showing us here in this kind of a book, is that we don't have to necessarily disconnect the life of the mind from the life of the church, even though sometimes it's hard to hold it together. Steve, you've been doing pastoral ministry again yourself, haven't you, as well as teaching?
Right.
Mm-hmm. Tell us just a little bit about how you experienced that use of some of these sources of light, in a practical church context, and make use of some of that academic experience as well, or how would you deal with that?
Well, it's helped me be conscious that on the one hand, I'm preaching and doing ministry in a very particular context, but I have the opportunity to to bring into that context some of the insights that come from all kinds of different contexts that are other than the experience of the members of the church where I'm preaching. And so I try to do that in ways that are less than obvious. They influence what I'm coming to see in the text when I'm preparing to preach, that I might not have seen in the text if I were only reading it through the lenses of my own experience. And so I hope that comes out in my preaching and helps people to think about something they might not have thought about before, to imagine living in the world in a way that they might not have apart from the conversation that's going on as I'm preparing to preach, and that I hope is coming out as a part of the dialogue with the congregation.
Yeah, good. I'm thinking about a little bit the visual metaphor, and you mentioned this, I think, somewhere toward the end of your book too, the sources of light, this kind of picture of revelation coming through a diverse set of means through the people of God, and so there's light in a lot of contexts, and a lot of light comes through, and then you say also to turn the metaphor toward the auditory, to listening, and learning to listen to one another. And I thought that was a beautiful thing, just being open to that. But there's also that challenge that sometimes there's a lot of disagreement as to what constitutes light or what voices deserve to be listened to. And so this book comes from a pretty decidedly progressive side of Baptist life, I think. And I appreciate that and I enjoy that. And yet sometimes what some people call light, other people call darkness. And what some people might want to privilege as this is the voice we will listen to, other people say we're not listening to that. And sometimes that can go both ways. How do we make space and make a case for that kind of openness, especially in maybe, let's say, more moderate to conservative situations, or people that might feel like we're not so sure that this is something we're comfortable with? Can we help people be open to these sources when perhaps they've been conditioned to think, that's out of bounds?
Yeah, thank you for pointing to that, both visual, auditory image that we use. We address that specifically in the conclusion chapter, and in there say that essentially what you just have said, that oftentimes we hear these diverse voices as a cacophony rather than as a symphony that the Spirit is drawing out and leading. And I think that in my own work, one of the ways that or one of the things I think is really important is to help congregations see where their own way of doing theology and imaging God comes out of their own experiences. We see these memes floating around right now, like, if God looks exactly like you, then maybe that's not God. So thinking through, okay, how in our experiences as the kind of person, kind of community that we are, have we shaped God in our image? Because then I think that can give us compassion for how other communities have done the same. But then also another image that I use, and this comes out of both McLennan and Sobrino, is this idea of revelation as including both the speaker and the listener. So someone speaks and someone listens, and in that entire process is the role of, or is the where revelation happens, which means that both the speaker and the listener are going to be incorporated into what is reported from that revelation. And I think that, these individual chapters have done a good job at saying, okay, here's the theology that's come out of our context, right? This is how we have understood priesthood of all believers or calling. Now, what are the connection points between that and the ways that, or the things that we see and read from other contexts? So in my chapter, for example, making this connection between that, between priesthood of all believers and liberation theology. I hope that what that has done is showed, okay, initially we might hear this as cacophony, but actually, like, here are some connecting points to our own ways of understanding who God is, and that can help us have a more open mind to hearing theologies that come to us from different contexts and are different from our own.
Yeah, thank you for that. Steve, thoughts on it?
This is an example of what I've tried to facilitate without really calling attention to it from my own preaching last week. In the liturgical calendar, Protestants have had a choice of where they observe some things. Amy mentioned doing Reformation Sunday this past Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
We did it the preceding Sunday, just before October 31st. And this past Sunday, we observed as All Saints Sunday. Well, I made one of my illustrations for my sermon connected with All Saints Sunday, the practice that many of the Salvadoran churches had during the Civil War there in the 70s and 80s, of whenever somebody had been killed in that context, their name was read out in the liturgy, and people would respond presente, saying they are present. We're still connected with them in the communion of saints, and they are here with us as we worship. They are not dead, that they are alive in Christ. And so this rural, white, largely elderly congregation were now connecting their own sense of loss of loved ones, some of them in the past year, and longing to have that connection with them and sense that they are present with us, with people in a very different context that they may not have thought before about their efforts to follow Christ as Salvadorans in another kind of political context. The fact that they have identified with this has probably, I hope, opened up the possibility of imagining the other in some other ways that they may not have done had I not shared this illustratively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and it's meant so much to me through the years to grow into these new ways of understanding. Like now, All Saints Day tends to be one of my favorite days on the church calendar, and the church that I'm in loves to celebrate that way. We light a candle and remember, so we feel very comfortable honoring saints, whereas probably in the church I grew up in, that would have been a source of discomfort for people. They didn't want to think about it that way, or that came from something outside their tradition. Well, I appreciate that, and I think people of goodwill and open mind will want to experience these kinds of things. Maybe we'll just highlight some of the social locations that you mentioned, in terms of all the chapters, but liberation theologies, Black theologies, Hispanic and Latino theologies, Asian theologies, mistaking white for light, awakening to a truthful search for the light from modern and contemporary women's religious experiences, feminist theologies, womanist theologies, LGBTQ plus lives, refugee and immigrant perspectives, people with disabilities, light from interreligious sources, and light from ecological theology. So each one of those is a chapter. Each one of those could be a book, but they're distilled into a brief, sort of digestible statement with maybe directions toward the church listening to these perspectives. And then the life and community. Many of these are similar, but somewhat different individually, but confessions of faith in the ancient world, pre-Reformation women's contributions, confessions of the European Reformations, Baptist confessions of faith, Catholic magisterial sources, and then something very interesting we touched on very briefly, but navigating moral disagreement, how valuable that can be. Saintly Sources by Derek Hatch, talking about saints and All Saints Day this week. Traditional liturgical sources, contemporary liturgical sources, and ecumenical convergence. Wow, there's a lot here. And the good news is that you could dive into whatever piece you want. And I think paying attention to these, and then not only these specifically, but as exemplars for the kinds of things to pay attention to in our local church, because every local situation is going to have a context for listening to one another. And I think that that can be a beautiful and hopeful thing. So thank you for doing this. Do you have any concluding thoughts? I've given a little bit of an overview. We've dived into some of the overarching questions, I think, about the book, but anything else that you would just like to get across before we conclude our conversation?
I think that one image that's coming to my mind right now is pastor or preacher as facilitator. And, if we say that we're doing theology embodied and socially embedded, then that also implies that we trust that our folks are coming to the pews or the chairs or whatever they sit in our services, and that they are also contributing to theology. And so I think that having this kind of positive respect for the folks that we preach to is a really important aspect of this. Like, I am not just coming to change them or educate them. I am facilitating a global conversation in which they are also contributors and partners. And so I think that, we all teach and preach in different contexts. I'm in New England and Steve's in the South, and that looks different for us. But I really do have a strong conviction, and always did in my teaching as well, that that we are facilitating, and that the folks that we are facilitating for deserve the respect as contributors and participants in the conversation.
Yes, lovely. Yeah.
And I think for readers, the most valuable parts of the book are actually the for further reading 4 or 5 book bibliographies at the end of each chapter. The chapter may have sparked an interest. Follow up on that, pursue the for further reading. And then in the final chapter, we provided a commentary bibliography. One of the things we realized is that when people are preparing, pastors, ministers, for the work of preaching each week, if they reach for the typical commentaries that they learned about when they were in seminary, they're probably mostly written by white men. So we developed a bibliography of commentaries that came from other kinds of social locations than that. Following up on that, drawing on those commentaries for preaching and teaching would be a helpful way to use the book, I think.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for making a helpful contribution to church theology and church practice, and for all your work. And thank you too for your friendship and letting me be part of this conversation. So, Sources of Light, Resources for Baptist Churches Practicing Theology. I'll do my best to incorporate some of the things I've learned from this book. Thank you.